So we'll move on. I just want to make a plug for our certification program. We have a training coming up in the end of March in Palm Beach County. And then we have one in Broward, which will be the end of June. We try to do these at the end of each quarter. And then one in Miami-Dade, toward the latter part, well, maybe the middle part of the third. I don't know, I guess it is the end of the third quarter, which would be, I believe, late September or somewhere's in there. So for more information, go to the Landscape Inspectors of Florida website, www.landscapeinspectors.org, and you can find out information about those certification review classes, what qualifications you need in order to become a landscape inspector, and some information about signing up for the class and the exam. Okay, I want to move on. I think the goal here today is to try to talk about sustainability, and one part of that, of course, is putting in quality plant material, right? When we think about a sustainable urban forest, we think of an urban landscape, a streetscape such as what you see here in this picture. Excuse me, a little bit pixelated, apologize for that, but you know, people and infrastructure coexisting with trees and nature in harmony. So some definitions of sustainable. One, I found these on the web, and they're not necessarily the only ones, but to be able to be maintained at a certain rate or level, to be able to be upheld or defended, and causing or made in such a way that causes little or no damage to the environment, and therefore able to continue for a long time. So these are just some of the words that we think about when we have this concept of sustainability in front of us. And this is super important. So I want you to consider this. If we're about building and maintaining sustainable urban forests, then principles of right tree, right place, quality plant material, good installation technique, and maintenance best practices are the keys to making that happen. And if any one of those components is not present, the landscape is probably doomed to failure at one point or another. Why did I highlight quality plant material? Because that's really the focus of today's talk. It's on Florida grades and standards. Why is this important? Because when landscape plants fail in urban areas where we have multiple targets, bad things can happen. And so the picture you saw in the prior slide was a failed tree on a sidewalk area here in the town of Davie, Florida, in Broward County. And what was the reason for its failure? Well, codominance, too many trunks on one tree, and these trees eventually fail, either through self-wounding, decay, and or windstorms, okay? And it doesn't take a windstorm to bring a tree down. I've observed that on numerous occasions as well. Skilled landscape inspectors need to be able to identify tree defects, including such things as codominant limbs and bark inclusions. Here you see, I think, a really great example of a bark inclusion. This is courtesy of Dr. Ed Gilman. You see two trunks, not branches, but two trunks pinched in a tight union with bark basically included or trapped in the crotch, if you will. And so if you think about it, over time, not only are those limbs growing in length, getting taller, but they're also expanding radially, and they have no room to grow. And so they get pressed up against one another, they get flattened. When the wind blows, those two trunks tend to grind against each other. And the next thing we see is usually a trunk stain beginning to occur, as you see in the photo here, which is basically the byproducts of decay. And so the stage is set for a failure, such as what you see in these slides here. So be able to identify bark inclusions, because sometimes we see them on even young nursery stock. And those are trees that just, that needs to be rectified, or those trees need to be rejected. And we can talk about all of that in a few minutes. But again, as you see in the photo up here, the two trunks have peeled away from each other. The darkened area at the top of the crotch is the bark that was pinched inside that tight union, okay? You'd be surprised how many arborists still have trouble distinguishing bark inclusions. So we're trying to prevent failure. We're trying to keep these trees from falling onto targets. Insurance companies are all about that. We're losing a number of trees these days due to liability concerns related to tree failures. There's a significant part of our population that's afraid of large trees. They don't want anything to do with them. We've lost a lot of canopy in the last few years, particularly since regulations have been eased and it's become easier for folks to take trees out of private property. And so, all the while we're concerned about climate change and the fact that urban forests do play a significant role in cooling our communities, shading our communities, providing habitat for wildlife, and above all, sequestering carbon dioxide that's causing the planet to warm. We also see root defects, and quite frankly, I think many of our nurseries have excelled at improving the quality of their canopies in these trees. We still have a long way to go with managing root defects in the nursery, and if those are not corrected in the nursery each time those trees are stepped up, or when they're planted in the ground in the landscape, then we often see stability problems. Here's a couple of short close-up photos of trees that Dr. Gilman had photographed. And I think you can see that there's, despite the mass of fine, feeder roots, you see that the larger anchor roots, if you will, inside that root ball that's been washed out are many, many times circling around the trunk. So Dr. Gilman always taught us that a tree that has roots that circle does not adequately anchor a tree. So I've seen this out when I've done inspections as a certified landscape inspector while I was an urban forester for Davey. And of course, I continue to see it as I go about my way in my career. And I'm sure most of you have seen these kinds of things. This is preventable. This is preventable if production practices in the nurseries are observed, and also if people that are buying trees, installing trees, or inspecting trees can recognize these defects and know what to do with them. So the PowerPoint I have today, I'm going to have to go through it rather quickly because we don't have a lot of time, but it's based on the grades and standards that came out in 2015 and revised again in 2022. So there have been some corrections made to that. I want to give credit to Bill Burns, our Landscape Inspector Association Executive Director, former urban forester for the city of Sunrise, for putting most of this presentation together. So there are 7 steps when we are grading trees in the nursery. And most of my comments today, all of them actually, will be confined to hardwood trees. We could do another webinar on palm grading. There are new grades and standards that have come out for palm grading. Not probably something we're going to have time to get into today, but certainly worth learning about and understanding. So there are 3 matrices. I want you guys to think about. These are tables within the document, the Grades and Standards document, which is published by the Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services. And the tree species fit into one of these matrices, depending upon the species' typical size, okay? And so some of those include the matrix 1, the tall and wide maturing trees, matrix 2, your tall and narrow trees, matrix 3, the short and wide trees, and of course we also deal with multi-trunked in landscape inspections, don't we? We'll take a closer look at this. So here is a screenshot of the type 1 matrix for the tree matrix. And as you see it, and this again is available, I asked John if he would put this in the chat for you guys to download, but you can also just download the whole document by going to the Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services website, or Cherry Lake Nursery has it on their website, as does Marshall Trees. You can download this document and print it out for free. So the matrix, as you see it, we start with the trunk caliper on the left-hand side, and you can see for trunk calipers ranging in diameter from 1.5 inch to 10 inches. And we take that matrix measurement and then we read over to the right. You see there are columns that speak to the minimum tree height, the minimum crown diameter, that would be the width, actually an average of the width by the depth, and then a minimum root ball size, whether it's balled and burlapped or it's a container tree. You can see everything is driven by the trunk caliper. And so as the caliper increases, so do the minimums for height, crown diameter, and root ball size. Here's the type 2 matrix. Again, these trees are taller and narrower, so the minimums in most cases, at least for height and for crown diameter in particular, are going to be less than they would be for matrix 1. Here's matrix 3. With regard to what species fit into which matrix, there are nice tables in the grades and standards documents, so you can look it up. Japanese blueberry, matrix 3, live oak, matrix 1, Italian cypress, matrix 2, and so forth. And it's set up both by common name and with scientific name. So, and here's just another screenshot that shows you what that table looks like. You can see on the top there, matrix 3 tree, sweet acacia, African tulip is number 1, and so forth. So it's super important to be able to understand the matrix, how it works, because we're going to be using that when we get into some of the grading steps, of which there are 7. So we just look through a little bit here quickly. Red maple is an example of a tall and wide tree. The Hoon holly would be considered a tall, narrow, more narrow. Crepe myrtle would be short and wide. And so, some of these classifications you might argue a little bit arbitrary. Interestingly, in the 2015 version of the grades and standards, we had 5 tables and 10 grading steps. And the mandate of the committee that oversees the grades and standards, which is made up of some regulatory folks, some academic folks, and some growers, the mandate was to simplify the procedure. So we went from 10 steps to 7 steps, 5 matrices down to 3 matrices. So let's think about Royal Poinciana. So what matrix do you think that would fall into? Anybody want to say? Well, I'll give you the answer. It's tall and wide, matrix 1. And I think I already let the cat out of the bag on this one. The Italian cypress is going to be matrix 2, tall and narrow. And then Tababuia, there are a bunch that would fall into matrix 3, the trees that tend to be a little more broad spreading and don't get quite so tall. So that would be an example there. Now, the other thing I want to do now with you guys is go through these steps. Again, I said there's 7 steps. And one of my colleagues here in Broward County government created a short form, if you will, for grading these trees. And you can see there are 6 steps on this side of the form. And this is the back side, which is step 7, grade the root system, and then a final grade. So we're going to go through each of these steps, folks. And again, hopefully John was able to put this in the chat. I know you don't really have the time, probably, or the wherewithal right at the moment to print it out, but just be aware that this is the format we're going to follow. One other comment I might make is that the 7 steps have been very cleverly put together on a sort of pocket-sized laminated cue card. And so, unless you have a clipboard, a pencil, and the paper here, you can also be grading trees off of that laminated cue card. Okay, so let's go through. We'll do step 1. First of all, of course, we're going to choose the appropriate matrix. And so we go back to that table that I showed you a few minutes ago. We know our species, so you got to be able to recognize the species of the tree and know which matrix you're going to be dealing with. And then we're going to measure the caliper. The caliper is measured at 6 inches above grade. This is can be done with a caliper like the photo is showing here. It could be with a diameter tape. It doesn't really matter. But the point is we measure at 6 inches above grade for trees up to and including 4 inches. If trees are larger than 4 inches, when you do that measurement, then you're going to move the caliper up to 12 inches for those that are measuring over 4 inches. Okay, so we read on the caliper, this is a pretty good even 2-inch caliper tree. Here's another note, you always round down. So if my caliper was just below that 2-inch increment, that little mark there that you see next to my thumb, then you would basically round down to 1.5. Okay, we don't round up, we round down. That's just the way the committee had deemed that the caliper measurement should be taken. So that's step one. Step two, we decide we're going to now grade the trunk. This is the main leader of the tree. Hopefully it has one. If it's multi-trunk, of course, we would be looking at that differently. And so the little schematics that you see here, all of this is explained in great detail in the document. These are just excerpts from it. We look at the trunk from the bottom of the tree, if you will, at grade, all the way to the tippy top, and we should see if it's a Florida Fancy. There are 4 grades. This is the top grade. The tree would have one dominant trunk, okay? And there can be a little bit of curvature in that trunk, but not a lot. The main thing here is if the trunk divides into 2 nearly equal diameter stems, but only in the top 10%, okay, it still meets that Florida grade, or I'm sorry, Florida Fancy grade. It is not downgraded to a number 1. So let me go backtrack a bit here. There are 4 grades. The top grade is Florida Fancy. Those are kind of ideal, the best type of tree architecture that one could spec in a landscape plan. The next grade below Florida Fancy is Florida number 1, which is the one that is most often mentioned in landscape plans. And that's typically what inspectors are inspecting against. Is this a number 1 or better? And then the next lower grade, which would not be acceptable to pass, is a number 2. We'll get into all the details about what makes a 1 a 1 and a 2 at a 2 and so forth. And then the lowest grade is cull, C-U-L-L. These are trees that really can't be remediated on site, really need to either go back to the nursery, back into production, and have some significant correctional action made upon them, or perhaps planted in a mitigation area, or I suppose if they're bad enough, put in the dumpster or the compost pile or the burn pile. So again, Florida Fancy, when we're grading the trunk, if we have a bifurcation meaning that the trunk, the main leader, divides into 2, it can only be in the top 10%, okay? I hope that's clear. We move on and look at the number 1. Here you can have a bifurcation in the top half. So there's the answer to that one quiz question. If the tree divides into 2 trunks, then that becomes a number 1, so long as that bifurcation occurs above the midpoint, only in the upper half. Okay. And so, this would be a tree that, it would have a double leader, or potentially in the upper half of the tree, but we could still accept it as such. But not in the lower half, okay? And here's a little other note. The tip of the leader may be cut up to 1/10 of the trunk caliper without being downgraded. So this gets into when growers sometimes cut trees way back. The minimum here is it has to be, less than 1/10 of the trunk caliper if they're going to be reducing, the tip. And sometimes growers will do that because the tip gets crazy long and so forth, just to improve the overall appearance. So that's Florida grade number 1. Now in number 2, this is where that bifurcation now is below the midpoint, okay? Where the trunk divides into nearly 2 equal diameter trunks. And here's another aside. When we're looking at codominance, the definition is that the limb that we're considering potentially codominant is larger than 2/3 the diameter of the main leader. I'm going to reiterate that. So, is it a codom or is it not? Well, again, it has to be greater than 2/3 the diameter of the leader at the point where it's attached to the leader, okay? Now, in the diagram you're seeing here, on the left, they're essentially the same or very close to being the same diameter, and so therefore it's a codom, and the codom is occurring below the midpoint. That's what the dashed line is showing. So that tree on the left becomes a number 2. Now, another thing that can downgrade the tree is a dog leg, as you see in the middle little sketch there, where the trunk is offset in the clear trunk zone. not in the canopy, in the clear trunk zone, okay? And clear trunk zone basically is the trunk area that is beneath the lowest branch, okay? The lowest branch on the tree. That's your clear trunk, your CT. And if there's a offset that is greater than the diameter of the trunk at that point, then we can downgrade the tree to a number 2 on trunk structure, presumably because that defect is going to basically always be there. We do not downgrade a dog leg in the canopy. I'm going to repeat that. We do not downgrade a dog leg in the canopy because typically the diameter of that limb is smaller. It's not very obvious because there's canopy around it. I guess you could argue at some point when the tree is limbed up, it may become more apparent, but to some extent, trees, as they grow in age and increase in diameter, they can kind of work out some of this. One other condition that could create the number 2 category designation would be multiple codominance in the upper half. As you see here, they've got 4 or 5. I believe the verbiage is 3 or more, okay? And then finally, the last grade is cull. As I mentioned before, the trunk divides into nearly 3 or more nearly equal diameter trunks in the lower half of the tree. So again, you see the tree is becoming more and more difficult to manage in terms of having that nice architecture that we like to think about that, of course, will ultimately influence its ability to stay without breaking apart, right? But that's what we were kind of talking about at the beginning. Another example would be on the left where the leader is just diverges off to a crazy angle or is broken. We saw that down in Homestead the other day. The leader on a gumbo limb it was gone. It just broke right out. There was just a big wound on the top. And the only limbs that were left looked very much like this tree on the left. So that was a cull. All right, so that's step 2. We graded the trunk, and we would indicate that on our short form. We've already got our matrix selected. We've got our caliper recorded. We've now graded the trunk for structure in step 2, and we move on to step 3. And that's to grade the crown uniformity. And in this instance, we only really have 2 choices. Either it's acceptable or it's not. And this was another attempt to simplify the procedure. It used to be we had 4 choices, all 4 of the grades. And I'm not entirely wild about what they did with this, but basically there is no Florida number 1 or cull grade. It's either fancy, meaning acceptable, or it's unacceptable. And when they coined that as a number 2. The trees you see here in the photo are all number 1s. They're all acceptable. And generally speaking, we're looking at a relatively uniform canopy. It can have some minor voids, but again, I'm thinking, I want to pass a tree that the commissioner who maybe come past City Hall, for example, or on some property in one of our parks would say, hey, that's a pretty decent looking tree, Mike. I don't want them thinking, good God, why did he approve that ugly tree that has such a lopsided appearance? So this is rather subjective. We'll look at some that are considered unacceptable, and that would be these here, where you do have these large voids. The reality of it is, folks, a lot of these trees, especially if they're street trees, they're going to be limbed up. And in fact, most of the canopy on the day you inspect it is temporary. So that's why they didn't want to make too big a deal out of this stuff, but it still is important in terms of aesthetics. We want to be having landscapes that look professional and they have a nice appearance. Okay, so again, it's fairly subjective, but these would be examples of canopy architecture that would be considered unacceptable, and those up top there, these would be acceptable. So Florida fancy for acceptable, Florida number 2s for unacceptable. All right. So now we move on to step 4, and step 4 is simply, what is the lowest grade you've given the tree so far? And, if you gave it a fancy on trunk structure and a number 2 on canopy uniformity, it's a number 2. Do not average the 2. I've had people come to take the test, and the scenario is one's a fancy and one's a number 2, and they come up with a number 1. That's not correct. To follow protocol, in step 4, I call this the subtotal. we're going to go with whatever is the lowest grade we've given that tree so far. Okay, is that clear? All right, so now we move on and step 5. So step 5 is where we start picking apart the tree further, and this is where the matrix will come into play. And also step 6, which are considered even more minor defects. So in step 5, we're going to downgrade the tree from the grade we gave it in step 4 by 1 grade if any one of the following statements are true. So if we came out of step 4 with a fancy and one of these A, B, C, D, or E characters is apparent, is true, then we're going to reduce the grade by 1. If we can say yes to 2 of these, then we're going to reduce the grade by 2. Okay, so let's look at these. Step 5A, tree does not meet the height requirement. Where are we going to get that answer? We're going to go back to our matrix, right? So there it is. Let's say we have a 3-inch caliper live oak, and the minimum height is going to be 8 feet. So if the tree is coming in at 7 feet, we can downgrade it. Now, I think these are very generous minimums. I hope you agree with me, but it is what it is. So that's that. Tree does not meet the height requirement. In this case, let's say it's 10-footer, so it certainly would. Crown does not meet the diameter requirement. Okay, well, let's go back to our matrix. Again, 3-inch caliper live oak. The minimum crown diameter needs to be 4 feet. Now that's a measurement, and you're going to eyeball this, guys. You're not going to be getting out a diameter tape, or not a diameter. You're not going to be getting out a yardstick or a pruning pole. It's got, markings on it. We do that in the class, but you're going to be eyeballing this. So that 3-inch caliper live oak needs to have a crown diameter minimum of 4 feet. Okay, and that's typically an average of the width by the depth. Just average it. Okay. So, and then we go and step 5C, the root ball is not secure enough to successfully transplant. Okay. So when I'm buying trees, I am pulling on that tree and that container. I'm in a container nursery. And the root ball and the tree should move as one. So I'm pulling it forward, pushing it backwards, side to side. The tree and the container are moving as one unit. Okay, that's great. That means that root ball is secure. If the tree starts wobbling around, moving, but the container doesn't, that's not good. That suggests one of two things. Either you've got some root defects, or the root ball's been fractured, or even possibly it just got stepped up. Maybe it's in a 25, but it's really a 15, or it's really a 7, So you need to know your container sizes too, by the way. Step D, 5D root ball or container is undersized. This is huge. A lot of times, if the grower is not selling his material as fast as he should, he's not stepping it up, we get some pretty good sized caliper trees in some really small containers. And you know what that means? Root defects, which we'll get to at step 7. So, and last but not least, 5E, the tree has a trunk caliper larger than 2 inches, requires a stake to hold the trunk erect. We know that when trees are staked too long, they become lazy and they don't stand on their own. So it's ideal to make sure that these trees get, produced with good form and yet not dependent on their stakes. And so, whereas it used to be 1 inch, now they've increased the minimum to 2. If you're grading and inspecting a site where the trees are being installed and they have caliper larger than 2 inches and you're not taking the stake off, the training stake I'm talking about, guys, you really can't complete the inspection, right? Step 5E. How are you going to make that determination if that stake is left on the tree? Okay. So again, any one of these 5 statements, if they're true, we reduce the grade we gave the tree and step forward by 1. If 2 or more are true, we reduce the grade by 2. Okay. So that's step 5. Those are the major downgrades. Now I'm going to move on to step 6, the minor downgrades, and then we've just got one more step and we're done. Keeping an eye on the time here. So we call step 6 the minor downgrades. Now, in this situation, it takes 2 true statements, and I'll go forward. I'll show you there are 6 of them. G, I've scratched out because that used to be in the 2015 and 2022 revision. They took it out. I left it in just so you all know that that was in there, and it's not something that we're grading against anymore. This issue, by the way, trunks and major branches touching, I still see with fairly frequency with ligustrum, but it's been removed, so we don't worry about it. So what are some of these minor downgrades? Takes, again, 2 true statements in order to reduce the grade by 1. If 3 or more are true, we're going to reduce the grade by 2, okay? By the way, in the case of a fancy, you can only have 1 of these true. Okay, so flush cuts were made when pruning branches from the trunk. Branch stubs are present, or open trunk wounds are evident. So these are the first 3. I want to talk about flush cuts. When a proper cut is made, we're not downgrading trees because of proper limb removal. Cuts that leave a small branch collar on the trunk as they should. That's a small swelling where the branch attaches to the trunk. That should be left on the tree and not be cut flush to the trunk, whereby trunk wood is exposed, okay? So you have to know what a flush cut looks like. And again, in the document, there are lots of photos that explain in more detail what this stuff looks like. Hopefully, most of you are familiar enough with landscape plants and pruning to know what a flush cut is and be able to recognize it, but still, you'd be surprised. Branch stubs are kind of the opposite. That's where too much of the branch was left on the tree when the cut was made, the removal cut. And so you might have a ½ inch, an inch, God only knows how much. And so that's also something that could potentially be a downgrade. But again, it takes 2 true statements here, not 1, to downgrade the tree. And know that the branch stubs can be removed very simply. But that's not reason to let it go. I mean, you would have to put that on the punch list as a must do in order to accept the tree. And then C, open trunk wounds are evident. Now about wounds, this is where a lot of confusion seems to occur. Wounds are considered open when they are greater than 10% of the trunk circumference and or more than 2 inches tall. So that's a pretty sizable wound, okay? If it's less than that, we don't worry about it. And also make a note here that, again, proper pruning cuts, just like we discussed, surface abrasions or scratches to the bark or the trunk should not be downgraded. A lot of times trees in production nurseries in South Florida are tethered to cables that, hold them up so they don't keep falling over when the wind blows. And so sometimes we get scuffs, abrasions, tiny little wounds, and we're just not going to concern ourselves with that. Let's keep the big picture in mind here. And then we got 3 more step 6D, more than 10% of the crown exhibits necrosis, that's browning, okay, dead, chlorosis, that's yellow, or damage from pests, diseases, or tip dieback. So back in the days of the whitefly, the spiraling whitefly, you remember that time was so difficult with the gumbo limbos in particular. This was a big issue. We still see some of that around, but not like we did back then. It could be low-bait lac scale on Jap blueberries, for example. But again, more than 10% of the crown has to be affected. Step 6E, the crown is thin and sparsely foliated. Okay, that could be the sign of lack of vigor. It could be the sign that the tree had been maybe didn't get enough water and it dried out for a period of time, and maybe it's beginning to come back or it came back partially. This is where I like to use the green scratch test, okay? And also don't forget, right now, this time of year, trees are defoliating because it's early spring. And so don't be downgrading a cypress tree or a live oak, for example, if it doesn't have many leaves on it. It may just be in seasonal leaf drop. So again, green scratch test, your fingernail, pocket knife, you scratch the limbs. If they scratch green, they're limber, they'll bend, not snap, then tree's got life in it. And then last but not least, step 6, F, there is included bark between the trunk and major lateral branch or between main trunks. So that's something we discussed at the very beginning of our hour. Hopefully you were able to take that in and can recognize included bark. So step 6, if you were able to answer yes to any 2 or more of these 6 statements, then you would downgrade the tree further from what you gave it in step 5. If you only found one of these 6 statements true or none of them, then you leave the grade as it was at the end of step 5. And this is just a shot from the grades and standards. It explains, it's an example of included bark. I'm not going to spend any time on it because I want to get to the last step since time is marching on. Now here has to do with the root ball. Step 7. So we're kind of in the home stretch here. The tree is a cull if one or more of the following conditions is true. Step 7A, and this is new. The topmost structural root, we call those the first order roots, guys, roots on which are among the largest on the tree and emerge from the trunk, more than 2 inches below the top of the root ball surface. Too many nurseries have not adequately trained their people to step these trees up in a timely manner and plant them at the right depth, and they plunge them every time they step them up. And it's not uncommon to find the first order root, the large root that comes off, we call that at the root flare, 4 or 5 inches down into the root ball, way too much soil on top of that root plate. And so what does that do? It encourages adventitious roots, which can become stem girdling roots. It deprives the tree of oxygen, which roots need to breathe. They just don't need to be wet. They need to breathe as well. Don't forget that. So that's a common error, and that can be a downgrade because it's such a common problem. Now, know that that can be remediated very simply by removing that soil such that the root is now within 2 inches of the surface. I personally like to see the flare and the very top of the first order root. And I've had some installers argue with me on job sites, well, I see a root coming out of here, it's a little diameter. It's not a first order root, it's a little adventitious root. No, sir, I am looking for the first order root. This is an anchor root. It needs to be within the top 2 inches, okay? And then step 7B, and this is interesting. So 1 or more roots greater than 1/10 the trunk caliper circle more than 1/3 of the way around the top quarter of the root ball. So this can be a root that circles around the stem and is a stem girdling root. It can be a root that's out in the middle of the root ball somewhere or out at the edge of the container circling, going around, okay, more than 1/3 of the way around in the top quarter. Now, it used to be 1/3. That was the 2015 revision. And then it was the top half back in, I believe it was 2008, perhaps, prior to the 2015 revision. So you can see that the location of these offending roots keeps migrating toward the top. And some of us inspectors were kind of concerned about that. And I'll tell you the origin of this change came about because, as I'm told and understand, some of the growers on the committee, there was concern that inspectors, some of them were being overzealous and probing around and digging way down into the root balls and causing damage to the trees. I don't know whether that's true or not. I always felt like if you really need to investigate, you should be able to do that, but put the soil back and make a note of what the condition is. But anyway, at this point in time, these offending roots can only be in the top 1/4 of the root ball. Now, I did ask Dr. Gilman about this, and I said, Ed, I don't quite get it. Why does this keep changing? And he said, because the reality, Mike, is that the major anchoring of the tree is going to come from those upper first order roots. And a lot of those roots down at the bottom of the root ball, in the bottom of that container in particular, container trees do this a lot. They're basically kind of non-functional. Once that tree gets established in the landscape, a lot of them are going to rot off. They're way below the level at which they're going to get adequate oxygen. The major anchor roots up top are the ones that are really going to take off and grow and anchor the tree. So that's kind of the explanation there. So, and yes, you can cut these roots. I don't really have time to get into remediation. You can shorten or subordinate codominant limbs. You can remove stubs. You can take training stakes off of trees. You can cut, circling roots. You can do all these things as a part of remediation, which will frequently take a number 2 back to a number 1. It's much more difficult to get a call back up to a number 1. But as an inspector, I always carry 2 colors of tape with me, red or orange for removal, and green, sometimes pink, but usually green for remediate. And I make a punch list, and we could have a whole webinar on what the punch list is like, and how much you take off and all of that. Unfortunately, we don't have time. So I want to make one other mention on this circling root issue. This is another change that they made in 2022. So if that circling root is above the first order root, as you see on the diagram B at the top there, well, it's also in D, that is concerning, because that stem girdling root, that circling root is going to put pressure on the anchor roots. However, if that circling root goes underneath all of the anchor roots, as you see in sketch A, and I guess it's C, the photo, then we ignore it. Okay. Now, between you and me, if I was planting that tree in my backyard, you darn know I'm going to cut it. But this is a distinction that the committee wanted to make, so you need to know about it. So anyway, that's the procedures, the 7 steps. And as we get back to thinking again about sustainability, right tree, right place, get that done, check. Is it quality? Now you know how to evaluate quality, and then you've got proper installation technique. And then the piece that is most often missing in our sustainability equation is the follow-up best management practices, and that's where we've got a lot of other issues to work on. But again, for today, we were just focusing on the grading of the trees, and now I want to turn your attention to a couple of examples, because I guess we've got, what, 7 minutes left, John? So we'll do a couple here very quickly, and if you were, for whatever reason, able to print out one of those short forms for grading, well, God bless you, and we can follow along. So just again, to review, what caliper measurement is this? This is 2 inches. Okay, remember, we always round down. Okay, so in that case, this is going to be 1.5, 2, and this one's 1.5. Okay, I hope that's clear. So I've got a few questions here. We'll talk about these, and then we'll do one of the tree examples. So what is the defect called here? Hopefully you recognize this as codominance with bark inclusion. Potentially the trunks are up against each other. I think the one on the left is probably about 2/3 or more the diameter of the main leader. So this would be downgraded to a number 2 because it's occurring at 4 feet and the tree was 10 feet tall. So what's the midpoint? The midpoint would be 5 feet. This tree is bifurcating below 4 feet. Therefore, the trunk would be graded as a number 2. In this case, why would this red maple not grade out as Florida Fancy? Because the multiple trunks that you've got, if you will, the codoms, are in the upper half of the tree. And they're certainly below that 10%, right? Remember I said for Florida Fancy, you need to have no codominance in the upper 10%. It looks to me like you've got a couple of codoms in the upper 20, 25, 30% of the tree. So it would grade out probably as a number 1 on that aspect on trunk structure. I would consider perhaps knocking this tree on canopy uniformity because it's so one-sided. So we could maybe knock it down there to a number 2, but the discussion for another day. Here's a pink tababuya that has a caliper, a measurement of 2.5 inches. Why can we not complete the inspection at step 5? Because the caliper is over 2 inches and there's a training stake on the tree, right? Remember 5E? There should be no training stake left on the tree if it has a caliper greater than 2 inches. So that would be a downgrade. We couldn't really complete we couldn't evaluate stability here either, really, with the training stake there. So would I downgrade the tree for surface abrasions and scuffs that you see? No, I would not. Those are minimal. they're not really exposing trunk tissue, trunk vascular tissue. Now this one's a little more of a concern. We do have a crack in the trunk. It is probably in excess of 2 inches, and the fact that I see some discoloration could make me want to downgrade this tree because of that, the discoloration. Let's say that's kind of a liquidy, sticky kind of material. That would be a concern. That suggests an open active wound that, you know, is greater than 2 inches. So I would probably not accept that as a number one. Okay. And then was this a proper removal cut? Absolutely, 100%. That's a really nice wound closure, and I'm very happy with it. This one, not so much. And again, you know, this stuff is subjective, guys, but, you know, it was a flush cut. It is closing kind of partially. I guess if you want to be technically correct, you'd say, no, this was not a proper cut. It was a flush cut. So that would be one mark against the tree in step 6A. However, again, remember, it takes two, not two flush cuts, but another issue of those 6 in step 6 to downgrade this tree. Okay. And then here's one. This is pink tababuya. They all get holopothrips, you know, unless they're on an imidacloprid diet. And so greater than 10%, yeah, kind of, sort of. It's also got some discoloration. Not good. So, you know, again, we can't downgrade the tree by one grade. If it's solely got this issue, we'd need another one of those minor downgrades to get reduced the grade. But definitely more than 10% of the canopy affected here. And then, do you see any issues with this root ball? My main thing here to you would be, I don't see any flare. I would maybe want to dig a little bit, see if I could find some first order roots in that top 2 inches. So this tree looks to me like it's kind of deep. And then we did that, and lo and behold, we found this. So, that's a stem girdling root. So if that goes more than a third of the way around the tree, and it's more than 10% the diameter of the trunk, that would be considered a cull. Even if it was a Florida fancy, if you found this defect, that would make it a cull. Of course, as I said before, that root could be cut at the point where it originates, and you would end up with an acceptable tree with everything else being okay. So I want to go through just one example here. We'll do the paradise tree. We've got just, gosh, 1 minute. I'm going to be really quick, guys. We did get a late start. So here's a tree. It's 12 feet tall. This is a nice tropical. We measure the caliper. Hopefully you're going to get 2.5 inches on that. We check for codominance. I'm not really seeing it, guys. This looks pretty good. And if there is any codominance up the top, it may be within the upper 10%. I'm going to give this a fancy on structure. And we see that the tip of the leader is the tallest. That was one other factor you needed for a fancy. So I'm okay with this, leaving this a fancy. Is there a dog leg in the trunk? No. So we got a fancy there. And then I'm going to grade for canopy uniformity. I'm going to look at the front and the sides of this tree. And there you see both the sides looking good. So I'm still giving it a fancy. So step 4, it's a fancy. Now we go down to the step 5, looking for those minor downgrades. We know the overall height is 12 feet. So for a type 1 matrix tree, which this is, we said 2.5 inch, right? So it needs to have a height of 7 feet. And we said that it was 12. So it's certainly okay there, right? Read over. The minimum is 7. The canopy width we've determined is about 4 by 4. And the minimum there for 2.5 inches, 3.5 feet. We've got 4, so we're good there. Uh-oh. Step 5C, is the root ball secure? Bingo, guys, we got an issue here. You see how the soil line is cracking? That suggests to me we got some root defects in there. And so we will need to continue on and probe a little further, go through all the steps. 25 gallon, is that acceptable for a 2.5 inch? Yes, it is. So the container size is okay, right? 2.5 inch, 25 gallon. So to determine the lowest grade, we're going to reduce our fancy to a number 1. right? Because of that soil cracking, the root ball is not secure. So it goes from a fancy in step 4 to a number 1 in step 5. And then very quickly, we'll move through step 6. Any flush cuts, branch stubs, or open trunk wounds? Guys, this trunk it was beautiful condition, so we're good there. Any pests, sclerosis, dieback? And how's the crown density? It's looking good there too. Any bark inclusions? All these limbs are small, so I wouldn't expect it. There were none, just telling you as it was, as I recall. So we're still at a number 1 at the end of step 6. And then we go to step 7. And planting depth is fine, but good God, look at what we've got. We've got a large stem girdling, circling root that's going around more than 1/3 of the way. That's a big issue. And you can see where that root and that trunk meet. There's an inclusion. We can have bark inclusions between roots and trunks. So big issue there. My number 1 from step 6 now goes to be a cull. Now, can you remediate that? Yeah, probably. Get your pole saw, or not your pole saw, you're pruning your root saw out, maybe even a little sawzall action. Possibly cut that puppy back to the point where it originates. I would not cut the root that's plunging straight down. Sometimes when you do this, you'll find there are other stem girdling roots, and that's very common with this species, by the way. Then you may end up deciding, I think I'm not going to accept this. Just remember, if you approve it, it's your John Hancock. And if there's an issue down the road, some tree falls on somebody or something, and the lawyers get involved, it's very possible it will come back to, well, who inspected and accepted this tree, who grew this tree, who installed this tree. They'll be looking for, pockets. So anyway, that is a concern. And I hope that this all has gelled a little bit in your minds. It's your turn to go out and do this on your own now. I would encourage you to come to Landscape Inspectors Review class in Palm Beach County the end of March, or in Broward the end of June, or in Miami-Dade the end of September, and go through the certification if you have not already done so. Do we have time for any questions, John? I know I'm just a bit over.
Well, I guess, yeah, we can go ahead and if people got to go, they got to go at this point.
That.
But if we could hang on for a little bit here. So there was a pretty good one that popped up in the Q&A here, Mike.
I didn't see it, John.
I'll read it off to you here. So this is from Joe Samnick. He says, how can a tree with a 3-inch caliper be justified to be attached to a tree height of 16 feet or greater? The grades and standards states that that's okay to do. And then is the root ball size? So I guess then maybe there's a separate question here.
Well, let's take the first question. So can you repeat it? A 16-footer?
Yeah. So how can a tree with a 3-inch caliper be justified to be attached to a tree height of 16 feet or greater?
Well, I'm not seeing anything about 16 feet. In this case, if it's 3-inch caliper, it's matrix 1, I'm assuming. Okay. They only give minimums. There used to be maximums and minimums, and when they revised it in 2022, the committee took away the maximums. So I'd have to go back to the 2015 version and see what the maximum was at that point in time to even, respond to the question, Joe. But
well, here's the rest of it here. So and
then
the root ball, and then is the root ball size, if a 3-inch caliper tree is specified and a 16-foot tree is delivered with a root ball size of 3-inch of a 3-inch tree, how can this be justified? I know it's kind of
what is the container size that he's talking about?
So I don't think he has a container size listed.
Oh, I thought that was part of the question, because it should be in a 45-gallon at that point. There's a big change that occurs from 2.5 to 3-inch caliper.
Oh, he's saying for field grown.
Oh, for field grown. They've got 32 inches. So that's from the side to side. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not really sure quite what Joe is asking, other than is he thinking that those those sizes are not in proportion to what a 3-inch caliper matrix 1 tree should be. Yeah, so when we went to the 2022 and they simplified the grades and standards, they took away a lot of the maximums and just went to minimums. Okay. So not sure if I answered that question, Joe, but feel free to email me, anybody, at morf, that's me, at ufl.edu. Morf, MORF, at ufl.edu. It's much simpler than spelling my last name. Any other questions, John?
Okay, so here's another one from Yelena Hall. So what about mildly and slightly weed racked trunks? I guess this was when you were talking about like damage defects. As long as the wound is less than 2 inches, can it be passed?
I guess, Elena, it depends. We have some definite metrics given in the grades and standards on that with regard to, more than 10% of the trunk circumference. Let's see here, right? Let's go to look at the grades and standards here. And or more than 2 inches tall. So I'm thinking weed eater damage is probably not going to be 2 inches tall, but it probably is going to be more than 1/10 of the trunk circumference. So if it's just an abrasion, that's one thing. If it is like exposing trunk wood, then that is more of a cause for concern. So that would be my response there. It is a surface abrasion, a scuff, even cutting through maybe several layers of phloem. But certainly if cambial tissue, if that, sapwood is exposed, that would be a negative. Okay. But again, remember that's a minor downgrade. So the thing here to keep in mind, guys, is, a lot of this stuff is subjective, and the more you do it, it becomes second nature. But still, 2 inspectors may not even agree on the same tree. I don't want to belittle the value of grades and standards. It's huge, but sometimes people get off base, and some inspectors have gone way overboard, and they've angered some of the growers. We've had those discussions in our auditorium here between the two groups, and we need to kind of try to come to some middle ground. And I think that's what the attempt was with this current version.
So there is a second question here from Yelena. Are there tree species which wouldn't show the uppermost root flare? And she says, I've inspected some Verawood trees which only had fibrous roots in the top 2 inches. I wouldn't pass them, and I was catching hell for it.
So I've had several during my tenure as urban forester for Davy. People try to push the fact that there were fibrous roots within the top 2 inches. And well, actually, that was even prior to this version of the grades and standards. In fact, they didn't address planting depth. But if I was inspecting today and I could not find any kind of root flare, any kind of trunk flare, any kind of first order root, I'm not passing it. Now, sometimes Ed has taught me that an adventitious root could turn into a first order root. I guess if it's been, developing long enough. We saw that actually at Satin Leaf Nursery on I think it was a pink tababuia. But usually these first order roots they're going to have some taper to them. They're going to have strong attachment to the trunk, almost like a branch collar. They're noticeably different than a fibrous root, which is probably originating as adventitious. So I would suggest that that tree probably was plunged. It was too deep, and so I think she was probably right to take off for that. You can always have the depth of planting was probably the most common issue on my punch list. And I had these guys unstrap these trees, elevate them oodles and oodles of times. That was probably the most common defect or issue I saw when I was doing inspections. And here's one other thing, with the pruning, typically we like to reduce the offending codon by, I would say, at least half. There are some guidelines in the grades and standards on that, but if you have an installer who doesn't know about how to do that, you can certainly use that as an educational moment. I did it a few times, but don't let them make you do their work. I had one contractor who will not be named that Every time I had an inspection ticket for him, he'd stand by and twiddle his thumbs and have me prune the tree. Well, I'm not doing that. I said, Tom, I says, if you're coming with me to town hall after we're done here to help me enter my inspection tickets in time, so I don't get, feedback from the building department, you're gonna have to accompany me, but this is your job. I've shown you how to do it. Now it's your turn to take the bull by the horns and get it done, or I'm not passing it.
I think we're getting a lot of people thanking us here. You want to go ahead? I guess I'll go ahead and post the
Yeah,
post
put my
quiz.
email up. They're more than welcome to email me at morf@ufl.edu. I'm happy to take anybody's questions as best I can. Sometimes we may have to talk to Dr. Gilman's. He's still available to some extent, and even though he's retired. But anyway, it's been a pleasure. So thank you so much, John, and everybody who participated today. And if you haven't gotten your LIAF certification, I highly recommend you do it. Again, end of March in Palm Beach, end of June in Broward, and end of September in Miami-Dade. Okay? Thank you all. Be well.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
All right, I'm gonna post the quiz here, and then yeah, if anyone's got any questions, like go ahead and shoot us an email.
You might want to recommend, John, that those people that are still on do the post quiz.
Yeah, I'm popping. I just got it to pop up right now.
Yeah, I see that. Okay. I'm going to sign off.
All right, thanks, Mike.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Hey, John, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can.
Great job, buddy. Great job.
Oh, thank you. No, I'm glad that you were here and that hopefully it was something relevant, and I mean we'll try and keep building here, and we'll follow up with the recording of this webinar,
Oh,
and
perfect.
and then
Perfect.
hopefully we'll have the schedule for the rest of the year out as well, like in that email.
Great, John. And just one quick question, I leave you be. Mr. Orfanedes' email address is morf, MORF, UFL @edu.
So yes, it's MORF @UFL.edu.
Got it. Thank you so much, John.
Yes, sir.
And if there's anything, I know that there isn't, but if I can ever do anything for you, just let me know, please.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, and yeah,
A
stay in
le-
touch for sure.
a legal seminar,
Oh,
uh,
legal. Okay.
trees in the law, neighbor trees, neighbor disputes.
Yes. There's always that's always a question, something that comes up as well. So yeah, I'll try and keep that in mind here for next year.
Okay, great, John. Have a great day now.
Thank you. You too. Take care, Joe.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll. And the majority of the respondees got these, so. But we'll go ahead and cut it here. All right, folks, well, take care. Hopefully we'll see you next week or next month, pardon me.